For decades, it has been treated as the ultimate milestone, the finish line where suddenly you get to feel freedom and security. Hitting that seven-figure benchmark is supposed to be like crossing into a new world of possibility. But here's the surprising truth. For many retirees, $1 million is more than they would ever need. For many retirees who retire with this amount or even less, they often end retirement with far more than they ever started with. Financial media loves to hype the $1 million mark. It's clean, it's round, and it's dramatic. But reality tells a very different story. The median net worth for Americans aged 65 to 74 is about $410,000. The average net worth for that same group is much higher, around $1.8 million. But that average number is heavily skewed by the ultra-wealthy. And let's face it, most retirees aren't living like the top 1%. But here's the kicker. Most retirees aren't simply relying on their investments in retirement. Most heavily rely on Social Security. Currently, the average Social Security payout is about $2,000 a month. Now let's put some context to these numbers. The typical retiree spends about $4,600 a month, or about $55,000 a year. But this includes all retirees. So let's break it down and add some nuance. But that average number is heavily skewed by the ultra-wealthy. And let's face it, most retirees aren't living like the top 1%. But here's the kicker. Most retirees aren't simply relying on their investments in retirement. Most heavily rely on Social Security. Currently, the average Social Security payout is about $2,000 a month. Now let's put some context to these numbers. The typical retiree spends about $4,600 a month, or about $55,000 a year. But this includes all retirees. So let's break it down and add some nuance. If we simply look at all consumer households, they spend about $73,000 a year. But if we look specifically at households aged 65 and older, spending drops to about $57,800 a year, or roughly $4,800 a month. Again, we can break this down by age group. For those aged 65 to 74, spending is a little higher, at about $60,800 a year, or roughly just over $5,000 a month. For those aged 75 and older, it drops to around $53,500 per year, or just under $4,500 per month. The trend is clear. Spending tends to decline with age. Yes, healthcare costs may increase, but spending in nearly every other category tends to decrease, including entertainment, travel, and food. As a result, overall spending tends to decline. Let's look at an example. Say we have a household with two retirees, both collecting the average Social Security benefit. Together, that's about $4,000 a month, or $48,000 a year. Now let's compare that to the average spending for retirees aged 65 to 74, which is just under $61,000 a year. That leaves an annual shortfall of about $12,800 if that couple were willing to withdraw from their investments at a 5% withdrawal rate. They would need only about $256,000 in savings to cover that gap. Not $1 million, not even $500,000, just about a quarter of that amount. What about a single retiree receiving the average Social Security benefit? That's about $2,000 a month, or $24,000 a year. Spending may be somewhat lower when you're single, but many expenses don't get cut in half. Some of the biggest costs, such as housing, utilities, taxes, and insurance, remain largely the same. Some of those expenses may remain fixed. So, for this illustration, we're going to keep the spending benchmark at $60,800 per year. In this case, that leaves a gap of $36,800. At a 5% withdrawal rate, that person would need about $736,000 in savings to bridge the gap. Even here, living alone and covering about $37,000 a year from investments, we're looking at a portfolio that is still well below the $1 million mark. Now, let's look at a couple who wants to spend more generously in retirement. We'll say $75,000 a year. It's above average, but it's not extravagant. It may include a bit more travel, helping their kids or grandkids, and simply enjoying life a little more. They're still collecting 2 Social Security checks, so we'll assume Social Security provides $48,000 per year. That leaves a gap of $27,000 per year to be funded through savings. At a 5% withdrawal rate, they would need about $540,000 in investments to make that lifestyle sustainable. Again, notice the pattern. We have a couple spending more than the typical retiree, and they still don't need $1 million nest egg. To enjoy a comfortable retirement, many people can get by with modest savings combined with Social Security. And this is true for a large number of retirees. This is really the heart of it. When you factor in Social Security and recognize that spending tends to decline with age, that magical $1 million benchmark becomes far less relevant. For many households, that number isn't $1 million. It's much less. Instead, we should be asking better questions. Rather than asking, "Do I have $1 million?" the real question should be, "Do I know my number? And is it enough to support the life I actually want to live?" Here's something I see over and over again. Scroll through the comments section on any retirement video and you'll notice that people approaching retirement are often concerned that their spending will stay the same or even increase over time. On the other hand, when we hear from those who are well into their retirement years, many say that their desire to spend has naturally declined with age. This lived experience is backed by research. Nearly every study shows that retirees naturally spend less as they get older. Not because they have to, but because their interests change. They spend less on travel, less on dining out, and less on entertainment. Life tends to become a little simpler, and that's reflected in their expenses. So, when you, 25, look at the data and listen to the real-life experiences of retirees, the math becomes clear. You may not need $1 million to support your lifestyle. Of course, everyone's situation is different. It ultimately comes down to your personal expenses. But many retirees live comfortably on far less and still enjoy a secure and fulfilling retirement. Here's where things become even more interesting. Studies show that many retirees actually finish retirement with more wealth than they had when they first retired. Researchers call this the consumption gap. Essentially, it's the difference between what retirees could spend and what they actually do spend. Why does this happen? First, habits. If you've spent 30 or 40 years as a diligent saver, switching into spending mode may not come naturally, especially if you've built your identity around growing and preserving your wealth. Second, loss aversion. Watching your portfolio decline after a withdrawal can feel like losing money, even if you know the math says you're on track. Third, uncertainty. Concerns about longevity, inflation, market volatility, and other financial risks can create fear. That fear often causes people to hold back. Financial planner Michael Kitchis ran long-term simulations on the traditional 4% rule, and the results were striking. Retirees withdrawing just 4% of their portfolio each year weren't just financially secure. They were far more likely to end retirement with 5 times their starting wealth than they were to run out of money. Imagine retiring with $1 million and ending up with $5 million. Or imagine retiring with $500,000 in investable assets. Some might consider that a modest investment portfolio, yet in many scenarios, you could still end retirement with more than $2.5 million. And Bill Bengen, the original creator of the 4% rule, has said that more than 90% of retirees who follow it end up with more money than they had when they retired. Why does this happen? Because historically, the markets have delivered more long-term growth than a 4% annual withdrawal typically consumes. Even with all the ups and downs, a balanced or blended stock-bond portfolio tends to give back more than a 4% return. Add in the fact that many retirees often spend less than planned, especially in later years, and portfolios naturally compound instead of shrink. And remember that the 4% rule itself was designed to survive the absolute worst-case scenarios. Retiring at the start of the Great Depression, or right at the start of the 1970s stagflation. If you retire into average or even better conditions, it's truly conservative. Now, Continuing to grow your portfolio throughout your retirement years can be fantastic if your goal is to leave a legacy or leave something behind to charity. But it is worth asking yourself, is that your real goal? Or are you shortchanging yourself when you could otherwise be living more fully? Here's another striking data point. J.P. Morgan found that the most common withdrawal rate among retirees isn't 4%. Not even close. It's just 2%. Imagine that. Most retirees withdraw just 2% of their portfolio. Why does this happen? We have the fear of running out of money.
Even when you know from a data standpoint or on an intellectual level that you have a safe plan, uncertainty can feel overwhelming.
For many, they simply don't need as much as they thought. Again, once many retirees hit retirement, they find that their spending is not as much as they thought it would be, or that Social Security fills more of the gap. Also, it's really only taking what you need. For many retirees, they look at their investments as more of something to touch in a worst-case scenario or an emergency, rather than looking at them as an ongoing income source. So, on the one hand, you've got a system that is designed to sustain you. Research-tested withdrawal rates, decades of market history, and layers of safety built in. And yet, over and over, retirees don't trust it enough to spend. They underspend, they preserve, and they end up with a portfolio that is growing rather than declining. And this may sound like a good problem to have, and for your heirs, it is. But for retirees, it very well could mean missed opportunities or experiences delayed until it's too late. Let's zoom out. The financial industry loves a good round number. It makes a great headline, but it doesn't match the reality of real life. Here's the truth. The median retirement savings for people aged 55 to 64 is only around $185,000 to $200,000. Most people aren't even close to hitting $1 million in investable assets. Yet millions retire in a stable and comfortable way. And why is that? Because the system isn't built around a single number. It's built in layers. Once you look at Social Security, a pension, modest savings, maybe some modest income, and some home equity, the picture changes. Once you add those together, many households find that they already have enough to live the lifestyle they want. And there's another stat I want to break down and add some nuance to. We often hear that about a quarter of retirees rely on Social Security for 90% or more of their income. That may sound alarming, and sometimes it is. That could mean households with little to no savings or investments are living from one Social Security check to the next on a tighter budget than they ever imagined. But that same statistic also includes people at the other end of the spectrum, those with very healthy Social Security checks. Imagine two high-earning spouses, each collecting $3,000 a month in Social Security benefits. That's $6,000 per month or $72,000 per year, all guaranteed and inflation-adjusted. If their lifestyle only requires $6,000 a month, they could have millions in savings sitting untouched and still be counted as relying on Social Security for 90% or more of their income. Why would they tap into their investments if they don't need to? Social Security is your first line of defense. It shows up every single month, regardless of what the market is doing. And if it covers all of your expenses, there's no need to touch your investments. This is just one more reason why I think that magic $1 million number is so misleading. In reality, Social Security alone often covers about 40% of retirees' income needs on average. And for some households, it covers nearly everything. For many, if you have Social Security and modest savings or a pension, that $1 million mark truly becomes irrelevant. Saving that much would leave them with more money than they could ever spend. The real risk isn't falling short of an arbitrary benchmark, but chasing a number that doesn't truly reflect your lifestyle, which could otherwise mean working longer and missing out on years of freedom. So, how do you figure it out? Step 1. Start with your expenses.
What does your life really cost? Don't guess. Write it down.
Step 2. Tally up your income sources.
Social Security, a pension, rental income, part-time work, it all counts.
Then see what's left. That gap is what your nest egg has to cover. And remember, your nest egg is not about bragging rights. What matters is that you use a withdrawal rate you're comfortable with and live the lifestyle you're comfortable with. So, when you see the math all laid out, maybe you realize you need $1 million. Maybe you realize you need far more or far less. What matters is figuring out what works for you, not someone else's headline. You've worked too hard for too many years to let a myth dictate your retirement. The so-called magic million might grab a headline, but your retirement isn't a headline. It's your life. Leave them in the comments down below. I post new videos every single week. If you got anything at all out of this one, please give it a like. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. And if you know someone who might benefit from this type of content, please consider sharing it. I'll see you soon. Bye.